Hello, you guys, and welcome to the first lecture of the year. Today we will be talking about Athenian democracy and ancient Greece. This is something that if you've been at Basis for a couple years, you've definitely talked about this before, learned about this before. So we're going to kind of speed through some of the events of ancient Greece, the wars and whatnot that you've already learned about in the past. And for this unit, we're really going to be focusing on Athenian democracy. So this is the beginning of our unit on classical government and classical modes of power and authority. We're going to be looking specifically at Greece, Athens, specifically in Greece, Athens, Rome, and the Han Dynasty in China, and comparing and contrasting those three together. So let's get started. First of all, I want to make a quick note about dates. So you guys have probably seen these terms before, but just in case you have not, I want to make sure everybody is aware. I use the terms BCE, meaning before Common Era, and CE, meaning Common Era, to mark dates in this class. This is the current accepted mode of historical notation for dates among historians. You might be familiar with the older method, which were AD and BC. BCE is basically the same thing as BC. It marks the same period of time, and CE marks the same period of time as AD. The only difference is that this notation system is not inherently connected to Christianity the way that BC and AD are. And so we use that version instead. You might still sometimes see the older version in textbooks or readings or when I mess up, but I'm trying to stick to the new version. All right, so to start off with, let's get a little context. Where are we in history? Where are we geographically? So today we are talking about Greece, this region here in the middle, which you can see in blue. And we're specifically talking about Athens, which you can see labeled on the map. The first city-state or the first civilization in Greece was the Minoan civilization, which was created on the island of Crete. They were around for a couple hundred years. They left some really cool ruins, but they declined around the year 1000 BCE. And after that followed a period of time which was known as the Greek Dark Ages. It was called that because during that period of time, Greeks didn't really use any form of writing. There was a very strong oral tradition. This is when you have stories like the Trojan War and the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's when those stories were passed down by word of mouth. But they weren't written down for several hundred years because the Greeks weren't writing anything down. We call it the Dark Ages because to historians, they're dark. We don't know anything much about that period of time except what we can glean from architecture. Greek history starts to pick back up and writing starts to pick back up by 500 BCE, which is when we are focusing in on. 500 BCE is generally considered the start of the Greek classical era. That's when Athens and Sparta started to rise to power, and they went toe-to-toe with the powerful Persian Empire, leading to their golden age. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. By 500 BCE, the Mediterranean was really dominated by the Persian Empire, as you can see on this map. The yellow portion is showing the Persian Empire, and really it's only showing a fraction of the Persian Empire. Persia expanded farther south and east off the edge of this map. And none of the other civilizations in the Mediterranean really held a candle to Persia at this point. Greece was a collection of quarreling city-states. Rome was a baby. It was really only a city-state itself. It had not started creating its empire. And the Phoenicians were in decline. So the big head honcho was Persia. Greece really changes that when they go toe-to-toe with Persia in the Persian War, which launches the Greek Golden Age. So what is Greece? What's it like? Greece is a peninsula which is about the size of the state of Louisiana, and it sticks out into the Mediterranean Sea. It's very close to Egypt, to the Persian Empire, and to Rome. So it had trading relationships with each of these places, as well as some military altercations with each of these places. Greece as a peninsula is very mountainous, which really affected the way that Greek society and Greek culture developed. A lot of the land was divided from each other either by mountains that were hard to get around or by sea. There's lots of smaller peninsulas and islets and islands that people would have to go around in order to communicate with each other. And because of this, Greek communities often developed independently of each other. They created their own diverse cultures, their own forms of government, and they also tended not to get along. They fought each other quite a lot, especially for resources. Greece was not a resource-rich land. The soil was not very fertile. And so these city-states that developed often were at war with each other for more resources and more land. So as I alluded to on the last slide, Greece did not have any centralized government. Instead, there were many different polises or city-state. Polis literally means city in Greek. So if you think about cities in the United States, like Indianapolis, all that's saying is that that is Indiana City. So polis means city. There were many different polises in Greece, as you can see on the map here. And each of these city-states had their own different cultures, their own governments, their own laws, their own armies. They had separate economies. They even had separate currencies, which made trading between them sometimes rather complicated. And for a long time, the Greek city-states didn't have any clear leader. There were some that were more powerful than others, especially places like Sparta or Corinth or Thebes, but none of them were really a leading power until after the Persian War, which is when Athens, which had been a bit of a nobody up until that point, rose to power and became really the leader of the Greek city-states. So as I alluded to, each of those city-states had different governments, different types of governments. And there were several different types of governments that you would find in ancient Greece. There was monarchy, which was a government ruled by a single person, usually a king. Oligarchy, which is a government ruled by a small group of people, usually wealthy men, although it could be people who were nobles and got their power based on lineage. An aristocracy, which you might have heard of, is a form of oligarchy in which nobles are in power. Then you also have tyranny, which is another form of government by one person, but this is the person who seized control, seized power of the government by force. And nowadays we use the word tyrant to mean somebody who is too powerful and overexerting their power. Called a tyrant nowadays is not a good thing. However, in ancient Greece, tyrants were often champions of the people. They were usually powerful military leaders who seized power in times of corruption or in times of crisis in order to champion the common people. So tyrants were often looked on as a good thing in ancient Greece. Our last form of government is very unique, which is democracy. Democracy is, of course, a government ruled by the people where all citizens share in ruling power. Athens is the most famous ancient Greek democracy, of course, because it was the first Greek democracy. It was the first democracy in the history of the world. So we owe a lot of how our government structure works to Athens. So we have all of these city-states. They are fractured, they are fractious, they are fighting each other all the time. They have different cultures, different governments. How do we get to a point where Greece becomes somewhat unified and has enough cohesion to have what's known as the Greek Golden Age? Really, the cause of this unification is the Persian Wars, also known sometimes as the Greco-Persian Wars. So the cause of the war really comes from a region on the western side of Anatolia called Ionia. So prior to this, many Greeks were leaving Greece to form colonies in other parts of the Mediterranean, especially in Italy and in Anatolia. As a bit of a side note, this is a large part of why Greek culture overlaps with Roman culture so much, because there were a lot of Greek colonies in Italy when Rome was founded and when Rome was growing. And so that's why there's such an intersect between those two cultures. But we're focusing more right now on the colonies in Anatolia. Anatolia, if you are not aware, is the name for the peninsula, which is now modern-day Turkey. At that point in time, Anatolia was under the rule of the Persian Empire. And this was a problem for the Greek colonies on the coast of Anatolia in the region called Ionia. And in 499 BCE, the Greeks in the region of Ionia rebelled against the Persians, and they were aided in this rebellion by Athens. Now, this rebellion did not go well. It was put down immediately and rather easily by the massive Persian army. However, the Persians were really angry with Athens for helping out in this rebellion. And so they retaliated by invading Greece. So the Greeks go to war with the Persians, and if the Greeks had not banded together, they would have most definitely fallen. By themselves, none of these city-states had the strength or the power to stand up to Persia. But by banding together, they were able to defeat Persia in a sort of David and Goliath situation where you have this massive empire being toppled by the relatively tiny and unknown Greece. After the war, they created what was called the Delian League, which was a military alliance against the Persians. Basically, the Greek city-states all signed on to protect Greece against Persia in the event that they came back. This involved donating money to a treasury on the island of Delos, where they could, so that they could keep those funds for the defense of Greece. Another side effect of the war, though, was that Athens became extremely powerful. Athens had been a major leader of the other city-states during the war. And throughout the course of the war, they had built up their navy until they had the most powerful navy in all of Greece. Um, and they used this power and influence that they had gained in the war to then gain power and influence over the Delian League. So much so that they began using the Delian League's treasury for themselves, building large temples and sculptures and funding the arts, and creating what's known as the Golden Age of Athens. So many people talk about the Greek Golden Age, but this period of time was really only a golden age for Athens. That was where most of that art and philosophy and and advancements were taking place, was in Athens. So Athens had risen to power and become the leader of Greece through the Persian Wars. So let's take a closer look at Athens. What was this city-state? They were a relative nobody before the Persian Wars. And after that, they became very powerful. And of course, their legacy has lasted even longer than that. The Greek Golden Age, the Athenian Golden Age, only lasted about 50 years. But we're still talking about them 2,000 years later. And it really has to do with their form of government, which was a democracy. Athens is, of course, famous for being the world's first democracy. However, that was not always the case. Before there was democracy, Athens had an oligarchy in which nobles in the city were the ones in power. In the 6th century BCE, there was ongoing fighting between the rich Athenians who controlled the government and the poor Athenians who were farmers and merchants. And this tension between the upper classes and the lower classes is what eventually led to the creation of democracy in Athens. So by 590 BCE, Athens was having a lot of economic problems. Athens' population had expanded, but their agricultural production was not keeping pace. That meant that there were more people, but not enough food. As a result, a lot of Athenians were not able to feed their families, and they ended up going into debt. And in Athens, the only way that you could go into debt was by basically selling yourself and your family into slavery. And so you had more and more members of the Athenian population in debt slavery. Meanwhile, the ruling council of Athens was made up only of nobility, and the people who chose the council was a different council made up only of nobility. And that meant that they weren't really beholden to the people. They didn't care if the people were suffering because they weren't going to lose power if the people didn't like them. They had very little interest in solving the problems facing the poor. Rather, they were more interested in increasing their own wealth, their own power, their own influence. This all comes to a head with the rise of a tyrant named Solon. So in 590, Solon rose to power in Athens, and he reformed the government and the economy. This is an example of one of those tyrants who comes in to be a champion of the people. His biggest reform was to outlaw debt slavery. So he outlawed debt slavery. He said nobody can do this going forward. He freed all of the slaves who were Athenian citizens. And he also abolished all debt. So he made it so that nobody had to pay back their debts, and just wiped the slate clean. Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't any slavery in Athens at this point. Athens had a fair amount of slavery even after this, but it wasn't a case of people selling themselves into slavery because they couldn't afford it. Slaves were instead people who were captured from other city-states, or debtors from other city-states. Athenians could not be made into slaves in Athens. Solon also adjusted the council so that its members' eligibility was decided by wealth rather than by lineage. This was a small change, but it did have quite an effect. Because when the status is decided by lineage, that means that only certain families were able to rise to power and be on the ruling council. By changing the deciding factor to wealth, none of those families that used to be in power lost power, but it did expand the group of people who could gain power. You basically just had to have a certain amount of wealth, a certain amount of land in order to be on the council. Still not a full democracy, but a step in the right direction. After Solon left, however, his reforms were really not kept up. There were a series of tyrants who came after him who were really more interested in enforcing the power and authority of the ruling class, of the wealthy and the elites. This all comes to a head in 508 BCE when another tyrant, Cleisthenes, rose to power in the city-state, supported by a peasant rebellion, and Cleisthenes does away with the system of oligarchy, and instead he establishes a democracy. So democracy, if you were not aware, is a form of government where political power comes from the people. So demo means the people, and kratia means power or to rule. So it really means the people rule or the power of the people. Greek democracy was a direct democracy. So that means that citizens were allowed to vote directly on laws and government actions. All of the citizens did this. This is different from a representative democracy, which is what we have here in the United States and also what they had in Rome. So we've got three pictures over here on the side. The top would be democracy in Athens, where you have a huge crowd of citizens, all of the citizens meeting and discussing their ideas, and then taking a vote where every citizen votes on every law. Underneath that picture, we have a picture of the Roman Senate, where you have representatives who come together to vote on the laws. And then on the bottom, you have a picture of the US House of Representatives, where you have representatives who come to vote on laws. So the direct democracy has the advantage of people being able to give their voice on specific issues, but it has the drawback of being rather slow. If you have to get everybody to vote every time, it's not really efficient, which is why most of the democracies in the modern world are forms of representative government rather than true direct democracies. The Athenian democratic government was broken up into three branches. The main part of it was the ecclesia, otherwise known as the assembly. This was the main governing body. This was the group that made most of the important decisions. It voted on laws, it decided whether to go to war, it determined foreign policy, and any Athenian citizen could attend these meetings of the ecclesia and could vote. There was also the boule, which made decisions about day-to-day governing, and the dicasteria, or the court, which decided legal cases. Both the boule and the dicasteria its members were decided by lottery, so people's names would basically be drawn from a hat, and they would be a member of the boule for a year or a couple of years. Under Athenian democracy, all citizens had the following rights. All citizens were protected by law against the arbitrary power of officials. So rather than it being the rule of the king, It was the rule of law. Everybody had to follow the same laws, and the power of the government comes from the laws, and comes from the people who create the laws, rather than from individuals like a king or a council. Citizens also all had equal access to the political process, and they had equal protection and access to the law. Um, so the law applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their wealth or status. And everybody was also had a right to a jury of their peers. These might be ideas that sound familiar to you because these are ideas that have carried over into governments of the modern age. Athens was extremely influential in the formation of later democratic governments, and it is the first government of its kind in history. All right, so we're going to end today with a video from TED Ed. So there is a link to this video in the assignment page for this assignment. So I'd like you to go and view that. And while you are watching this video called A Day in the Life of an Ancient Athenian, I want you to write 3 things that you learn from this video into your notes. Once you have done that, your exit ticket for today is to upload a copy of your notes to Teams. So if you hand wrote them, you can take a scan or you can take a picture and upload that. If you did them on the computer, you can upload your Word document or a PDF. But I want to see your notes from today. After you have done that, I hope you guys have a lovely day, and feel free to message me if you have any questions, if you want to ask me about something you were curious about or were confused about. I am always available in the chat. So, yeah.